gender or scenes which may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
To the women of Denver, Richard Paul White is an evil predator.
He would strangle his victims, and then a new session of terror would begin.
But to his sister Maureen, he's like the father she never had.
I can't remember a time that I didn't think of him as my hero.
When authorities finally track him down,
they started a manhunt to look for him.
Even police are surprised.
There was nothing to indicate that he had killed any other people.
And Maureen realizes the darkness of their childhood lives on in her brother.
He would say, I need help. I've got demons. I want to kill people or I want to hurt people. You can't believe it. You don't want to believe it, but it's right in front of your eyes and you can't deny it.
Richard Paul White is a vicious killer. In the early 2000s, he preys on the women in his community, terrorizing, raping, and murdering. But how does a person become a monster? How do the experiences of his childhood shape White into the intensely violent man that he becomes? In 1980s Colorado, Richard's younger sister, Maureen, relies on her brother to shield her from the brutality in their lives. She looks up to him and lovingly calls him RP.
RP was always the constant in my life. He was always there, and he was always my hero. Since the day I was born, I loved my brother. I can't remember a time that I didn't think of him as my hero.
As the eldest of three, Richard Paul White tries to protect his younger sisters Danielle and Maureen from a neglectful mother and a violent stepfather.
Shortly after my parents divorced, my mom met this guy, John, and they started living together. And he's the worst thing I've ever seen on the face of the earth. He was not a good person. And we lived from that point with him being a part of our lives.
Richard and Maureen's mother finds in John a fellow alcoholic.
They would go out and get drunk and come back, and you'd hear this pounding on the door, so we'd get woke up in the middle of the night, have to go let them in when they're just falling down drunk. And sometimes it was okay, but most of the time it wasn't.
Richard and his siblings often go for days without food because the social assistance that the family receives goes to feeding their parents' addiction.
John never worked a day that I knew him, not a day in his life. He would just expect my mom to get welfare and the food stamps, and then they would spend it all on drinking. And the food stamps, it was back when they had the actual coupons, and we'd have to go in and buy like 5-cent candies and take the change so that they could go buy beer or booze or whatever, you know, it was, cigarettes. And so, yeah, we had all these little 5-cent pieces of candy, but we didn't have any food.
Lying in bed hungry, Richard and his siblings listen to the sounds of their mother being beaten by their stepfather.
When my mom and John would start fighting, and the middle of the night, you know, we would be in bed, hiding under the covers. I would put a pillow over my head and push in on your ears really, really hard so you can't hear. When you hear someone hit another person, it doesn't sound like it does on the movies. It's this thud sound. And when you hear that and then she would scream, it would be okay. Because yes, she was being hurt, but she wasn't dead and she was still able to scream. And we would wait and see if she stopped screaming.
The daily brutality the children witness takes its toll.
I've never seen anyone beat someone else like I saw. Her face would be puffed out to here. She'd have a broken arm. He kicked her so hard he broke her pelvis. We watched that. And what it teaches you is how to stop your emotions for people, how to stop caring for people that you love.
The violence inflicted by their stepfather isn't reserved for their mother. The siblings are also beaten and tormented by John.
He bought a 9mm handgun, and each of us kids had a bullet with our name on it. And he would grab the gun and he would put it to RP's head. Every one of us had a gun put to our head. But having the gun in my head didn't scare me so much. It's when he put it to my mom's head, because the way he beat her, I I believe he would kill her.
Their stepfather is constantly on the run from the law, so Richard and his siblings are often woken up in the middle of the night to escape to a new town.
John always had trouble with the law. He always had warrants, usually for DUIs. We'd get in the car, carry whatever we could if we were lucky. We could get, blankets and pillows, and we'd leave, and we'd never go back. We'd leave pets behind. We would leave everything we had managed to acquire during that short little period of time, and we would go, and then we would be homeless. And we would be 5 of us sleeping in a car.
So often left to fend for themselves, Richard becomes the primary caregiver to his 2 younger sisters.
Mostly, it was my brother leading us on adventures. That was his way of protecting us and keeping us out of harm's way was, to take us, it was the only thing he could do, is take us away from there. He taught me how to cuss and how to ride a bike. We'd spend a lot of time at parks, and my brother always made sure me and my sister were safe. He always defended us, and he beat up the other kids. He was a lot like the parent that we didn't have.
Richard makes sure he and his 2 younger sisters don't go hungry.
That was our biggest concern, I think, in life as growing up, is where we were going to eat. When we were hungry, he would go into the grocery store and he'd steal his candy. We ate a lot of chocolate bars for dinner. But you know what? We ate something, and if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have anything.
As the siblings grow, the lack of a stable home becomes a way of life.
We'd get to a new town, and then we'd go to the shelters, the food banks, social services for emergency housing. But my mom, she would never stay anywhere John wasn't allowed. So a lot of times we would not have anywhere to stay because the shelters wouldn't allow men and women to stay together. And so she would choose, under a bridge rather than being separated from John.
The hungry and neglected siblings learn how to find resources in unexpected places.
We used to go to church every Sunday to eat. A lot of churches would send buses around to the neighborhoods and pick up people, and you go and you'd have, after service, they'd have pizza or some kind of, meal. So we would go as often as we could.
But in one small town, his experience at church has a profound effect on the vulnerable young Richard.
People would be, casting out demons and falling on the floor, speaking in tongues, and it was things that we didn't really understand. And we didn't have any parental guidance. We didn't have any adults to explain any of it. We were exposed to a lot of religious zealots and no guidance on how to interpret that. How to implement that into our lives in a healthy way. And so what we were seeing is these demons in these people, and at this church, I remember really well, everything's a sin. Everything is wrong. And we were definitely guilty of every one of those wrong things. It was at that point, I remember my brother told me, I have a demon.
Young Richard's conclusion that he's possessed by a demon shapes his behavior. Maureen learns to be wary of her brother's tendency to turn on a dime.
Well, I did kind of believe RP had demons. You could see them when he showed them. He's the kind of person that you enjoy being around until he decides all of a sudden he's not. And he does kind of... He turns very scary very fast. I don't know how his brain works, but if you said the wrong thing, you're gonna pay for it.
As Richard's actions become more unpredictable and erratic, Maureen learns to simultaneously love and fear her brother.
If he got mad, he would chase me and my sister around the house with a big knife, a kitchen knife, and I'm certain he would have used it if he would have caught us. He has a temper. He had so much anger suppressed, and I think that his temper had a lot to do with that, and maybe that's what he saw as his demons. I don't know.
At the age of 12, after years of physical and psychological abuse, Richard finally fights back.
The first time RP actually stood up to John, I can't imagine the courage it took. He didn't necessarily win, but I think that John realized then and there that this boy was growing into a man, and he posed a problem for John. And he had that rage inside, and I think John knew then and there that RP could take him at some point. Maybe not then, but RP could take him. And they allowed my brother to go live with my dad.
Despite escaping from his ruthless stepfather, Richard's demons are cemented inside him. This evil will grow to one day wreak havoc on the streets of Denver. Serial killer Richard Paul White knows nothing but violence. Before he terrorizes the women of Denver, Richard is the de facto caregiver to his sister Maureen, protecting her from their vicious stepfather and unfeeling mother.
My brother always made sure me and my sister were safe. He always defended us. He was a lot like the parent that we didn't have.
But an encounter with an extremist religious sect leaves young Richard convinced he's possessed by a demon.
But if you said the wrong thing, you were gonna pay for it. He turned very scary very fast.
Mustering the strength to finally stand up to his abusive stepfather, Richard is sent away to live with his biological father. Sister Danielle soon follows. Maureen is left to endure the abuse without the protection of her older brother.
That left me with my mom and John all alone. And I'd always had it the easiest. My sister and brother, they always took the worst of the punishments for me. But when they left, there was nothing for John to take everything out on, except for my mom and me.
As Maureen grows into a teenager, the family moves out of state, and John's cruelty becomes worse than ever.
I was in junior high, and she would come with, you know, like a black eye or a freshly swollen lip, and she would come and get me out of class, and I would just have to look at her. She would tell me, don't come home tonight. Those nights I would just find anywhere, an empty hallway, public bathroom. You could sleep in those if they're open all night. I'd go home the next morning, maybe walk by, you know, see if any windows were broken or what was going on.
But like the victimized Precious in the 2009 Oscar-nominated film, Maureen suffers from more than just physical abuse. Without Richard there to protect her, she suffers sexual abuse as well.
John was sexually abusing me, and I ended up pregnant because of it. I had a miscarriage. I ended up running away many times after that, and the last time I ran away, the cops found me and they were gonna take me home. And I told them, no, I'm not going home. And I told them why. I told them that John had been abusing me. And so the police officer got a hold of social services and they didn't make me go back. They put me in a foster home.
Charges are filed against John for child sexual abuse. Now a grown man, Richard is angry about the abuse his sister has suffered and comes to Maureen's rescue once again.
Testifying against John was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I was terrified of him. I didn't want to look at him. I didn't want to be in the same room as him. And having my brother there, he just gave me strength. I knew that he wouldn't let anybody hurt me. He never let anybody hurt me before, whenever he could stop it, and I knew he wouldn't let John hurt me.
But Richard and Maureen are horrified when their mother once again chooses to stand by her husband.
My mom did testify. She testified against me in the trial. Basically just made me out to be promiscuous and that I was just lying. I don't know what reason I would have to lie for that, but that's what the jury believed.
Ultimately, John is acquitted of the charges.
I really wasn't surprised when they acquitted him. We always knew that John was unstoppable. Nothing we did or said or told anyone was ever going to stop him from being who he was. He always was a couple steps ahead of the law because justice wasn't served.
After the trial, Maureen moves back to Colorado, thrilled to be reunited with her older brother for good.
So RP was an adult at that point, but we stayed close.
But as Maureen gets to know the adult version of her brother, She realizes that the demon from Richard's childhood has only grown.
He would say very, very sexual things about women. He had some very strange ideas about it, and I know why. It has never been a surprise to me.
Maureen realizes that the experiences of their childhood have had a profound effect on her brother's ideas about sex.
Growing up, for us, sex and violence were the same thing. We were taught that after you beat someone half to death, then it's time to have sex. And we saw a lot of that. Every time John would beat her, you know, they would end up having sex afterwards. The things that we saw, you know, from the violence straight into sex, it all led to a very, very warped sense on what is even okay, much less, you know, what's appropriate.
But Richard's disturbing tales aren't always about sex.
He would say the most outlandish things, always a flair for the dramatic. And it always had to do with violence and death, the things that he would say that we just didn't believe. He'd been through so much and seen so many things that it was all just in his imagination, is what I thought.
But as Richard's stories grow more threatening, Maureen becomes concerned for her brother's mental health.
He would say, I need help. I've got demons. I want to kill people or I want to hurt people. He wanted to go see a psychiatrist, someone who could help him to get rid of the demon that he thinks he has. He asked us to get him help. He asked us if we could help him find a place that would see him. You know, he was just going so crazy in his mind. He was begging for help, and we tried. Me and my sister called all over town, and he doesn't have any insurance, and nobody would see him. Nobody would help him. And he got worse.
With no intervention, the demons inside Richard are unleashed. In 2002, he starts prowling the streets of Denver.
In January of 2002, White picked up his first known victim at a bus stop in Denver. She was a working prostitute.
They made a deal in which they would go back to his house. And he clubs her in the back of the head, and she falls to the ground.
There, he bound her. He raped her. He stuck a gun in her mouth. He did all kinds of abusive sexual things to her.
But as Richard struggles with the demon inside him, he draws on the scripture he heard visiting churches as a child.
He then prayed with her. He had a thing that he believed if two people prayed together, then God would hear you.
He asked God if there was some different way that we could handle this other than to kill her, and God didn't answer him. It was a grueling experience because he held her for 26 hours. It must have been just horrifying for this woman.
Ultimately, Richard's demon wins. Like the villain in Alfred Hitchcock's classic thriller Frenzy, he strangles his young victim to death.
He disposed of her body in southern Colorado, and he just dumped her out on a property that was owned by his father. I think his intent there was that she would be eaten by animals and that her bones would be spread around, and that type of thing.
Giving in to his unholy urges gives Richard a sense of power he's been missing all his life.
There was a sexual component, but the ultimate for him is making her know that he controlled her destiny.
And as the demon inside Richard takes over, his evil acts have just begun. Serial killer Richard Paul White grows up in a violent household where he is beaten and psychologically tormented. From a young age, he believes demons are inside of him. As an adult, those demons can no longer be contained. In early 2002, he rapes and tortures a young woman and dumps her body in a remote area of southern Colorado. Richard's sister, Maureen, has no idea her brother has become a killer. But she does know he has a darkness.
I've always had a fear of RP's dark side. Anyone with any brain cells would. I love him, and he's the greatest guy in the world at times, but there are times he's not, and you can't just pretend that doesn't happen. It does. And you have to be careful around my brother.
Richard begins telling friends and family outlandish stories about death and violence, but no one believes him.
When he would say something crazy over the top, everybody in my family learned that he just said those kind of things, and we just took it with a grain of salt. We didn't believe him.
But Richard's stories are grounded in a terrible truth.
In October of 2002, he picks up his second victim. He took her back to the house, bound her, put a gun in her mouth, sexually assaulted her a number of times. He then prayed with her.
Once again, Richard tries to suppress the demon he believes is inside him.
So he would go from this extremely abusive person to this person that would want to know details about the woman. What is your family? Do you have kids? What are their names and ages? And pray with them. So he had this kind of split personality while he was, involved in raping and murdering these victims.
But again, the demon triumphs. Richard strangles his second victim and buries her in his own backyard. Despite her concerns about his behavior, Maureen shares happy times with her brother and sister.
When we did get together, it was a lot of fun. I went to visit him in the house that he lived in, and we had a picnic, and we had a good time, and the sun was shining. It was a very warm and happy occasion.
Richard is able to keep up appearances in front of his unsuspecting family. But in reality, he's become a cold-blooded killer. No longer trying to resist the demon inside him, Richard revels in the terror he inflicts. In late 2002, White picks up another victim.
His third victim was taken off the street. She was a prostitute. He got her back to the house, and that's where he'd become the monster.
He had this strangulation game where he would strangle his victims, but not to death, and wait for them to recover, and then a new session of terror would begin. When you strangle somebody, you're right there in their face, and you can see the expression on their face and their eyes, and they're pleading for their lives. And apparently this is what really satisfied him.
When he's done, he buries her in his backyard, along with his previous victim. No one reports any of the women missing, so Richard Paul White continues to roam the streets.
All of Richard White's female victims were people that when they disappeared, there was no report of them going missing. I think he's no different than many serial killers. They go after the most vulnerable members of society, the runaways and the prostitutes, because the prostitute is easy pickings for them because they'll climb into a stranger's car.
Richard's crimes continue to go undetected until he preys on a new type of victim. In early 2003, Richard's troubled life takes an unexpected turn. After losing both his job and his home, he meets a man who can help him turn things around.
Richard was a bit of a drifter. He'd been living in his car, and he met a 27-year-old man who befriended him and took pity on him, let him come and stay at his house. He actually got him a job at the same printing company that he worked at, putting in a good word for him. So he was doing everything he could for Richard.
But Richard's demon is never far from the surface.
On the night of September 7th, Richard decided that he was going to rob this person that was his benefactor.
After shooting his roommate point blank, Richard makes a call to his sister Danielle with another of his wild stories.
He was sobbing on the phone. He said, "Hey, something very bad happened. I've got to get out of here. Could you help me?"
What he said was that they were looking at this gun, that he was showing him how the safety worked, that he pointed the gun at him, pulled the trigger believing that the safety was on, and it didn't work. And he shot this man right in the face.
Believing that the shooting was an accident, Danielle agrees to help Richard hide out in the wilderness.
She picked him up. She took him to a store so that he could buy camping gear. And then she drove him to Pike National Forest. The victim was a very good employee. very reliable. He wouldn't just not show up for work. And so his boss drove out to his house, knocked on some neighbors' doors, asked him, have you seen him? They were able to get into the house, and that's when they found the body, lying in a pool of blood.
At first, police are unsure whether the death is a homicide or a suicide.
It's not unusual when someone is shot in the face and the weapon is there for them to know if they've got a suicide or a homicide on their case. Usually it takes further investigation.
But a story about the death in the local paper triggers a reaction from Richard's sister, Danielle.
The sister sees a newspaper article, and the article was at the stage where they were still sorting out if it was a homicide or a suicide. She was concerned about the idea that someone would believe this was a suicide when she knew full well that it wasn't a suicide. She came forward to authorities. When she made that call, they started a manhunt to look for him.
The Douglas County Sheriff's SWAT team searches Pike National Forest for 9 hours.
The sister knew the general area where he was going to hide out, and they got him into custody fairly quickly in this situation.
Richard Paul White is arrested for the shooting death of his friend and roommate. When Maureen hears the news from her sister Danielle, she's devastated.
I heard that his best friend was dead. I didn't know that RP had done it. I just collapsed. I just fell down. And I remember scratching my face, like just screaming and crying because you can't believe it. You don't want to believe it.
Police bring Richard in believing he's responsible for one murder. But as Richard starts confessing, just like with his family, his disturbing tales are dismissed as nothing more than wild stories. Years of abuse leave Richard Paul White convinced he has a demon inside. This demon leads him to torture and murder 3 women, burying 2 of their bodies in the backyard of his Denver, Colorado home. Because the women are prostitutes, their deaths go unnoticed. But when Richard shoots and kills his roommate, a manhunt ends in his arrest for murder. When his sister Maureen finds out her brother is a killer, she's devastated.
You can't believe it. You don't want to believe it, but it's right in front of your eyes and you can't deny it.
In the interrogation room, Richard admits to the shooting of his friend. But that's not all he wants to confess.
They wanted to talk to him about the murder of the male, and White wanted to tell them about other murders. And they really weren't all that interested. I think there was some degree of not believing White that he killed a whole bunch of people in Denver. They were there to focus on the one they knew about. There was nothing to indicate that he had killed any other people.
But Richard is determined to confess his crimes.
Finally, they just said, okay, tell us about these other murders. And he started to tell them about the murders. And when he started to describe how he disposed of the bodies, and he was able to draw a map of where these bodies were going to be found, it would have been negligent to not at least follow up on this.
Based on his confession, police begin digging up the backyard of Richard Paul White's former home. After hours of digging, they make a gruesome discovery.
I was the chief deputy on call. I got called out to the scene. When I got there, they had the first victim, they had taken her out of the ground. Her body had been crammed in this suitcase. The other victim had not been taken out of the ground yet. And what he had done with her is dug the hole, placed her down in the ground like she was in a crouched position, and then poured concrete on top of her. Both of them had very serious injuries to their neck area. They had broken cartilage. They had tissue damage, all of the kind of things that you see with ligature strangulation. It was a brutal murder. Both of these women were brutally killed.
As the bodies are recovered, Maureen receives another call from her sister.
She called me on the phone and she told me, I need you to sit down. And she told me that he confessed to more murders. And I didn't believe it because it sounds like more stuff that he would just make up. And she said, no, turn on your TV. They're digging up bodies. And they were. And it was there, and it was his backyard. That's when I knew that the things, outlandish things he said were true. I ate hamburgers in that backyard. At the time, it was a very warm and happy occasion. And I had no idea what had happened there in that house. And now I look back and it feels like you're looking at a picture, but the sunshine is very cold.
As the news of Richard's crimes become public, more victims come forward.
There were other females that he attempted to kill or raped that got away from him. They either came forward after he was arrested on the homicides because they saw him in the paper, or police, through investigation, were able to contact them and find out what happened to them.
The realization that her brother has terrorized and murdered vulnerable women blindsides Maureen.
You don't ever want to think someone you love and someone who's protected you and taken care of you could do something like that. But then to find out that he did it to women who are weaker than him, that's what I had the hardest time with, is believing that he would hurt something weaker than him because he was always the protector.
In a desire to understand her brother's crimes, Maureen looks to their childhood.
I think RP was, in his mind, killing my mom over and over again. I believe that, and that's my opinion. But he watched it happen, almost happen so many times at John's hands. I think that in some sick kind of way, that's what he was doing, is he was punishing my mom.
He had some very, very deep-seated things from his childhood that impacted the way that he behaved as an adult. He blamed his mother, that he really had this kind of love-hate thing when it came to women.
When he was talking to the detectives, he told them, you know, the only reason why I do this is that I'm sick, because I really do have a good heart. He told them that I cried with him. I cried and I cried. I prayed with them. Apparently he thought that he could persuade them that after strangling these women to death and torturing them the way he did, that they would think better of him.
After confessing to his crimes, Richard agrees to lead police to the location of another victim. He takes them to an area of land near his father's home.
I remember the day that authorities were searching for her body, and some officers led me to a shallow grave. I'll never forget that, just this lonely place in this desolate area, a very rural part of Colorado, and just left there to rot.
But with 3 bodies found, Richard Paul White isn't done confessing. A childhood of abuse and neglect unleashes a demon inside Richard Paul White. As a serial killer, he preys on the vulnerable women working the streets of Denver, Colorado. But after killing his best friend and roommate in cold blood, Richard's arrest brings an end to his heinous crimes. Richard's little sister Maureen can't reconcile the brother she knew with the murderer he has become.
He always protected the women in his family. I just couldn't wrap my head around that he would hurt someone weaker than him.
Once captured, Richard helps police recover 3 bodies of his victims. 1 in a field near his father's house, and 2 buried in his own backyard. But, known for his tall tales, Richard continues to confess to even more murders.
He said that he had killed not only the 3 victims in Denver, but he'd also killed 2 additional women, and that he had dumped them in some canals in Colorado. Extensive work was done to try to find those bodies. They drained the canals, he said he threw them in, and we were never able to find those other 2 victims. If they really existed or not, I can't tell you.
On November 29, 2004, Richard pleads guilty to first-degree murder and receives multiple life sentences.
He was also sentenced to 48 years to life for each of the 3 women that he had raped and tortured, and they had managed to escape.
Determined to be there for her brother, Maureen attends Richard's sentencing hearing.
I stayed for RP's sentencing until about 15 minutes before he came into the courtroom. And I went into a panic attack. I'd never had one before, but I was so upset and I kept crying and then I couldn't breathe. And I just kept gasping for air. I was in the same room as some of the survivors in the courtroom that day. And I didn't feel even worthy to be alive, much less be there, so it was better to leave anyway.
But still desperate for clarity about her brother's deplorable actions, Maureen watches a videotape of Richard's confession. She sees a man she barely knows.
I remember watching it and I got very emotional. I had my own mental break and I started cutting myself just out of the blue, never done it before, and I ended up cutting myself very badly right then and there. And I had to go to the hospital and have lots of stitches and lots of staples put in. 72 staples and over 250 stitches on the inside. When you feel so ugly and rotten and bruised on the inside, and all the world sees is just this person, they can't see what's on the inside. And I think at that time for me, cutting was my way of showing you this is what I look like on the inside. Watching what he said on his confession was so horrible and so horrifying for other people that I wanted to show them, I don't know, that I hurt too.
Despite his horrific actions, Maureen feels compelled to support the brother who once protected her.
My relationship with RP is the same as it's always been. That's one constant in my life that doesn't change. I write him, and he writes me, and I send him pictures. And we don't talk about anything deep. It's the same thing as when we were little. We can be apart. We can be apart for a long time or a long distance. And then you get back together, and it's like we were never apart to begin with.
But Maureen accepts that the demon inside her brother could reappear at any time.
I do still fear RP. If he were not in prison, I would be in hiding. He's dangerous. And he knows it. And we all know it. And I do still have that fear. They have contact visits at the new prison he's at. And I've not been there. That's the one thing about visiting him that does scare me. I don't think he would lose 1 minute of sleep if he decided he wanted the death penalty for him to snap my neck and kill me right then and there. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibilities at all. It's more likely that he'll give me a hug and tell me I love you, sister, and, we'll just sit around and joking. But he could just be having a bad day. And you just never know.
Maureen struggles every day to overcome the devastating childhood she and her siblings endured. She feels an obligation to help others, suffering through the same type of pain.
If I look back and I see those 3 little kids, it could be anybody's kids, and I see what they went through, it breaks your heart. And there's other kids going through that right now. It just takes one person to say something, and it could change a whole bunch of people's lives. It's all of our responsibility to watch for that kind of thing. Looking back, if someone would have helped, if someone would have stepped up and done anything, things could be so much different now. And that's why I decided to speak up now. It's because it's too late for those 3 little kids. They're adults, they've made their decisions, they've made their mistakes, and they need to suffer the consequences for those mistakes. But they weren't always adults, and there was a time in their life where something could have been done to prevent all of this tragedy from happening.
Maureen is now determined to stand strong in the face of adversity and trauma.
The only way to have any kind of life worth living is to keep going. So it took a lot to try to, come back from the brink of insanity. But my options are to die or to do it. So I just did it. I've got beautiful kids and beautiful grandsons, and there's a lot of good things in life. Giving up's not an option. I've got to set an example for them. It's all about breaking that cycle. So for my kids, absolutely. That's why I'm alive. They're worth it. So this really is the first time in my life that all the monsters have been put away. They're either dead or they're in prison, and I can finally relax. But more importantly, I've finally stopped moving around all the time. I lived in the same place. I bought land, I'm building a house, and I'm planting oak trees. And they will be there for 100 years, and I won't be, but I will be there for the rest of my years. And finally, planting the trees was my way of symbolizing, okay, this is home, and I'm putting my roots down, and nobody's gonna uproot me ever again. And I just wish that my sister and brother would have been able to find that.